Hello, welcome to the Crawcast. I'm your host, George Krawczak, and this is what happened in Week 4 of the NFL season. And if you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like you owes you money. The first game is the Dallas Cowboys versus the New York Giants. The Cowboys' leading passer is Dak Prescott, who had 221 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Rico Dowdle, who had 46 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was CeeDee Lamb, who had 98 yards and a touchdown. The Giants' leading passer was Daniel Jones, who had 281 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Devin Singletary, who had 24 yards, and their leading receiver was Malik Nabers, who had 115 yards. Overall, this game was very good in the first half. Both sides seemed to be firing on all cylinders, and then just in the second half, both teams really felt like they fell apart. The Cowboys definitely got hurt in this one, where they lost Micah Parsons and DeMarcus Lawrence. Who knows for how long they're going to be injured for, but both injuries looked pretty bad. And then with the Giants, Malik Nabers looks like an absolute stud. I would say right now he's probably the number one receiver from the draft class. And he just looks like an absolute stud at the moment and looks really, really good. So, unfortunately for the Giants, they lost, but at least Malik Nabers looks good. Their O-line and their run game was basically non-existent. And the Cowboys, at least they got a get-right game, and now they're at 500. And overall, the Cowboys are pretty happy with this. The next game is the Green Bay Packers versus the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings won 31-29. Their leading passer, or the Vikings' leading passer, is Sam Darnold, who had 275 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Aaron Jones, who had 93 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Justin Jefferson, who had 6 receptions, 85 yards, and a touchdown. And for the Packers, their leading passer is Jordan Love, who had 389 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Josh Jacobs, who had 51 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Jayden Reed, who had 139 yards and a touchdown. This game probably should not have been this close. The Vikings were up 28-0 at I believe halfway through the second quarter, and then the Packers, to their credit, just never gave up. The refs in this game were absolutely horrible. There's 3 passes all in the first half where they're kind of debatable about whether they're drops or catches. I think, in my opinion, it should have gone 2 were catches and 1 was incomplete. That's what I think the refs should have ruled. They ruled all 3 incomplete. And then the interception that Sam Darnold threw towards the end, that should not have been an interception. It clearly was not. And then the issue of Matt LaFleur and the timeout. So, I agree. I think Matt LaFleur maybe overreacted a little bit, but what happened was he called a timeout right in front of the referee's face. And at the end of the second quarter, there was like 20 seconds left. And the referee, for whatever reason, just didn't want to acknowledge the timeout. And then Matt LaFleur was yelling at him, saying, "Hey, I'm calling a timeout here." And then he called a 15-yard unsportsmanlike penalty on Matt LaFleur. It ended up not mattering because the Packers got a touchdown anyway, but that could have been a key decision decided by the refs. And I just think the refereeing in this game was overall completely horrible. And I think it might have cost the Packers, but also obviously it's on the Packers going down 28-0. They shouldn't have done it. They had a dropped interception, which the Packers should have had. The touchdown to Justin Jefferson, it was really good coverage, and Keyshawn Nixon just didn't see the ball. It probably should have been an interception, but Keyshawn Nixon just never bothered looking for the ball. And then Jordan Love, he initially looked a little bit injured, but overall I think it's just rust. This is only his second game back since January, and the Eagles game in Week 1, it was such weird conditions with flying conditions and the field conditions that I don't even count that personally, just because it was such a unique circumstance. So this kind of feels like his first game back. He was clearly a little bit rusty or a little bit beat up, but then towards the end he kind of found his groove and got into it better. And just the biggest concern here for this game is the defense of the Packers. Their pass rush was non-existent. I got last week that they had quite a few sacks, but those were more schemed up sacks. And just Rashawn Gary has been terrible. He was really good, then he tore his ACL, and he's basically been terrible and non-existent since then. Rashawn Gary really just needs to figure out whatever's wrong with him and play better. But overall, I think both teams played pretty decent, and there's not a lot of concern for either teams. The Vikings obviously look good, and they're happy to be 4-0. And just overall, I think both teams look good. And then also finally with the Packers, their kicker, Braden Naverson, he needs to get cut. He needs to be done. He's missed a kick in every single game. I get last week he missed a kick and it was negated by penalty, but theoretically he missed a kick in every single game, and he's just been terrible. Also, 44 looks disgusting on a kicker. Kickers should not wear 44. So at this point, almost anyone is better than him. Can't get much worse than him. So I think the Packers should probably cut him and just move on. And then also a positive for the Packers is Daniel Whelan, their punter, looks absolutely incredible. He's definitely one of the best punters in the league. So the next game is the Chicago Bears versus the Los Angeles Rams. The Bears won 24-18. The Bears' leading passer is Caleb Williams, who had 157 yards and 1 touchdown. Their leading rusher is DeAndre Swift, who had 93 yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver was DeAndre Swift, who had 72 receiving yards. And for the Rams, their leading passer was Matthew Stafford, who had 224 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Kyren Williams, who had 94 yards and a touchdown. And the leading receiver was Tutu Atwell, who had 82 receiving yards. Overall, the Bears played decent. The Rams played decent. I think the Bears' offense struggled a bit, even though DeAndre Swift definitely turned around. I know he was threatened to get benched, and he took that to heart and definitely turned it around and played well. But also, it's hard to grade the Bears fairly in the sense that the Rams are so injured. They're hardly a team. Like, it's literally Matthew Stafford and Kyren Williams trying their best to win these games, and it's a team of only those two players. And it kind of reminds me of the season after the Rams won the Super Bowl, where basically everyone got injured and the team fell apart. And that's kind of where they are now, where everyone's injured, the team's falling apart. Overall, if you're the Bears, you're very happy with 2-2. The Rams, like, you're not happy with 1-3, but I think you're pretty happy in the sense that at least you're hanging in these games with everyone being injured and not really having much of a team. The next game is the Atlanta Falcons versus the New Orleans Saints. The Falcons' leading passer was Kirk Cousins, who had 238 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is Tyler Algier, who had 60 rushing yards. Their leading receiver is Drake London, who had 64 receiving yards. For the Saints, their leading passer is Derek Carr, who had 239 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher is Alvin Kamara, who had 77 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Chris Olave, who had 87 receiving yards. So overall, I think both teams played pretty decent. The Saints should have won this. It felt like really just the Saints blew it, plain and simple. Their special teams blew it for them, and they just needed to play better. The Saints did. Overall, the Falcons, Tyler Algier looked pretty good. I think they do have two very capable running backs in Algier and Bijan Robinson. And then Alvin Kamara looks great as well, and he's really back on track, and I think he's going to earn himself a great big contract in this offseason. But if you're the Saints, I think you're just a little bit going back down to earth. They had such a high in the first 2 weeks, and I don't think anyone expected that because I don't really think that was a great representation of themselves. But overall, at least you're 2-2. Falcons, same thing. You're 2-2, and the division's really wide up in the air, and anyone can win it, even though the Buccaneers, I believe, are ahead. The next game is the Bengals versus the Panthers. The Bengals' leading passer is Joe Burrow, who had 232 yards and 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. Their leading rusher is Chase Brown, who had 80 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, and their leading receiver is Jamar Chase, who had 85 receiving yards and a touchdown. With the Panthers, their leading passer was Andy Dalton, who had 220 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. The leading rusher was Chuba Hubbard, who had 104 yards and a touchdown. And the leading receiver was Deontay Johnson, who had 83 receiving yards and a touchdown. So the Bengals are happy that they got a win. They did look pretty good. They looked good last week, even though they lost. And so the Bengals, you got to be happy of finally getting your first win and trying to turn the season around. The Panthers, honestly, I hate to say it, but they're playing well, and that's probably a negative for them. Because, number one, it's hurting their draft stock if they do start winning games, even though they did lose this game. As well as, you want to at least have the excuse of saying, hey, it's not Bryce Young, it's everyone else's fault but Bryce Young's. And with Andy Dalton coming out and playing really well these past 2 weeks, it kind of just says, no, it is Bryce Young. Everyone else is decent. Bryce Young sucks. And that is just a huge problem for the Panthers. I do think it is too early to give up on Bryce Young, but this is just not good news. That it seems like everyone's clicking on all cylinders except for Bryce Young. And the minute you take Bryce Young out of the lineup, that's when they start playing pretty well. The next game is the Houston Texans versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Texans won 24-20. The Texans' leading passer is C.J. Stroud, who had 345 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Cam Akers, who had 53 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Nico Collins, who had 151 yards and a touchdown. The Jaguars, their leading passer is Trevor Lawrence, who had 169 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Tank Bigsby, who had 90 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Brian Thomas Jr., who had 86 receiving yards and a touchdown. The Texans looked really good on this. C.J. Stroud looked good. Cam Akers had a decent production. And then Nico Collins had an absolutely amazing game. And then the Jaguars. Now you're in trouble. You're 0-4, and Trevor Lawrence is just sucking. And here's the problem. I get the Packers kind of had to pay Jordan Love early because it was the last year of his contract and it was expiring, and they had to either say he's our guy or he's not our guy. Whereas Trevor Lawrence, I believe there was still a year or two left on his deal, and honestly, I think they should have just waited it out a little bit. Just because I understand that if he does end up playing well, then you're only going to have to pay him more money. But now you're kind of stuck in a situation where it's like the Browns with Deshaun Watson, where they have to keep Trevor Lawrence. There's no other option, and he's just not playing well and hasn't played well for a while. And there's just no excuse for that. At least Brian Thomas Jr. looks good, but the Jaguars are really, really in trouble, and I don't know if they're going to fire Doug Peterson or not, or what's going to happen, but they are in big trouble right now and for the future of the season. The next game is the Indianapolis Colts versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Indianapolis Colts won 27-24. The Colts' leading passer was Joe Flacco, who had 168 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Jonathan Taylor, who had 88 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver was Michael Pittman, who had 113 yards. With the Steelers, their leading passer was Justin Fields, who had 312 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Justin Fields, who had 55 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is George Pickens, who had 113 yards. Overall, both teams look pretty good. The Colts, I think, should be a little bit concerned just with Anthony Richardson continuously getting injured. Last year, he left every single game except for one with injury, and then ended up missing almost the entire year last year of injury. And then now he gets injured again. He is not a good pocket passer. We need to acknowledge that. So he needs the run game to be a part of his game. But he needs to learn how to take hits well. For example, Lamar Jackson. He really hasn't been getting injured that much because he always slides. He always runs out of bounds. He learns how to take hits well to the point where he doesn't injure himself. And I get it that Anthony Richardson is a bit of a bigger guy and wants to try to run through people. But at some point you need to look at your safety. Joe Flacco, he came in and looked really well. And so it does get me curious if maybe the Dolphins or somebody's going to try to trade for him because the Dolphins are in huge trouble. But Joe Flacco, he's getting to the point where I think he might have to be a low-end starter. He was with the Browns last year and he looked pretty decent. He looked pretty decent in this game. And then with the Steelers, even though they lost and Justin Fields had that bad fumble, overall, Justin Fields looked pretty good. He honestly, this is one of his best games as a Steeler in the sense that, again, even though he had the turnover, this game he actually felt like he made an impact on the offense and actually played well. The next game is the Denver Broncos versus the New York Jets. The Broncos won 10-9. The Broncos' leading passer was Bo Nix, who had 60 passing yards and a touchdown. The leading rusher was Javonte Williams, who had 77 rushing yards, and the leading receiver was Cam Sutton, who had 60 receiving yards and a touchdown. The Jets' leading passer was Aaron Rodgers, who had 225 passing yards. The leading rusher was Braylon Allen, who had 34 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Mike Williams, who had 67 receiving yards. Overall in this game, both offenses struggled. The Jets basically had zero run game at all whatsoever, and the Broncos had pretty good defense like they've had this entire time. It's funny with the Broncos. They're at one point, I believe Bo Nix had like 7 passes completed for negative 9 yards. That's got to be a record or something. Like, how do you complete 7 passes and end up being negative 9 yards? That's insane to me. But what really killed the Jets here was they missed the field goal at the end, and they had a lot of penalties. There was one where Alan Lazard, he caught a first down and then did like the gun fingers or firing a t-shirt cannon, as Raheem Morris, I believe, said. Um, and the refs flagged him for was unsportsmanlike conduct. And I get it, so maybe if like guns are inappropriate for the NFL or something like that, but I think what the NFL needs to do is make this clear. They need to get like a sheet of paper or something and say, hey, this is a list of banned celebrations. If you do one of these celebrations, you'll get flagged. And then basically see, are the players doing those celebrations or not doing those celebrations, instead of it being up to a ref if he's like, oh, that celebration offends me on this particular day. So overall, the Jets, I wouldn't be too worried. Also, they had issues with their offensive line going off sides a lot. And it was kind of interesting because Robert Saleh suggested, well, maybe they need to do less of a hard count, which is kind of ridiculous because that's one of Aaron Rodgers' best things. And then Rodgers kind of fired back and was like, no, basically we need to coach the players better. And if the players aren't doing well, they need to, bench them and put their backups in. But overall, with the Broncos, their offense played horrible, and they still got the win. So I think you're happy with the Broncos because I don't think the Broncos are going to be a very good team this year. And then the Jets, unfortunately, fall for 2-2. Good thing for the Jets is that the Bills also lost, but yeah, they needed to win this game and they should have won this game. There's kind of no excuse for that for the Jets. The next game is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the Philadelphia Eagles. The Buccaneers won 33-16. The Buccaneers' leading passer was Baker Mayfield, who had 347 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Rachaad White and Bucky Irving, who both had 49 rushing yards, and Bucky Irving had a rushing touchdown. And their leading receiver was Mike Evans, who had 94 receiving yards and a touchdown. With the Eagles, their leading passer was Jalen Hurts, who had 158 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Saquon Barkley, who had 84 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Dallas Goedert, who had 62 receiving yards. The Buccaneers looked really good. They look like they're getting their season back on track. And this is a big issue for the Falcons. Really, since the end of last year, and well, most of last year too, the Falcons have looked terrible, and Jalen Hurts has looked terrible. This is what I've noticed is Jalen Hurts is kind of reminding me of Carson Wentz in the sense that, look at Carson Wentz. He had that near MVP season where he got injured, and then they gave him a big contract, and then he proceeded to suck afterwards. And that's what it feels like it's going now with Jalen Hurts, is he had that near MVP season before he got injured. Then they gave him a big contract, and he's really just been terrible. Last year, he was not good. Yes, they kept on winning a lot last year, but they kept on playing bad and somehow winning. And then this year, they're playing bad again. It's just kind of inexcusable. I did predict that I didn't think Jalen Hurts would be good, and I think at some point they're gonna have to at least think a little bit about moving on from Jalen Hurts, like be done with the Jalen Hurts era after the season if he continues to play like he is doing. And I get it, they had their top 2 receivers out, but still, even with injuries happen to every team, and not every quarterback sucks with injuries happening. Like, look at Matthew Stafford. He's still playing well, even though his top 2 receivers are injured. So it's just very unfortunate for Jalen Hurts and how he's doing. He needs to improve a lot. The next game is the Washington Commanders versus the Arizona Cardinals. The Commanders won 42-14. The Commanders' leading passer was Jaden Daniels, who had 233 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. The leading rusher was Brian Robinson, who had 101 yards and a touchdown. And the leading receiver was Zacchaeus. Okay, I will attempt his first name. Olamide Zacchaeus, who had 85 receiving yards. And then for the Cardinals, their leading passer was Kyler Murray, who had 142 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was James Conner, who had 104 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Marvin Harrison, who had 45 yards and a touchdown. Jaden Daniels looks like a stud. Granted, it's his rookie year, so defenses are still getting like acclimated to him, and so he might have a little bit of downturn come next year. But right now, he's definitely the best rookie quarterback out of this draft class, and I cannot believe the Commanders are 3-1. This is like the biggest shock of the season to me. And then the Cardinals, they're going on the downslopes in the sense that Kyler Murray had that one amazing game where they won, and then has proceeded to kind of be average ever since then. And Kyler Murray just needs to step it up, and I'm starting to be concerned for him. Not to the point where like I'm not as concerned about him as I'm concerned about Jalen Hurts, but Kyler Murray just does need to be better, and the Commanders of Jaden Daniels look phenomenal. And like I said, that's the biggest shock of the season, how good the Commanders look. The next game is the San Francisco 49ers versus the New England Patriots. The 49ers won 30-13. The 49ers leading passer was Brock Purdy, who had 288 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Jordan Mason, who had 123 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Juwan Jennings, who had 88 receiving yards. For the Patriots, their leading passer is Jacoby Brissett, who had 168 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Ramondre Stevenson, who had 43 rushing yards. And the leading receiver was Antonio Gibson, who had 3 receptions for 67 yards. And honestly, this is a game is what we kind of expected all year round, is the 49ers to play well and the Patriots to suck. The Brock Purdy is looking like an absolute stud, playing really, really well. Brandon Ayuk has finally gotten involved at least a little bit. He had that one great catch. And Juwan Jennings is also looking really good. Like, this whole team on the 49ers is just such a stacked team that they are phenomenal. It does suck that it looks like Christian McCaffrey will probably be out for the year. And who knows, maybe even out for his career. So who knows what's going on with that. But again, even without McCaffrey, they still look like the team to beat, like a really, really good team. And then with the Patriots, this is kind of their plan all year long, is they're not taking this year seriously, and they just want Jacoby Brissett to play, have Drake May learn the Patriots processes, learn the Patriots playbook, and just sit and learn. And next year they'll get a top draft pick, hopefully get better receivers and a better offensive line, and then maybe they'll be good for Drake May next year. But this year it's just, hey, we're just gonna suck. And when we try to be good next year, who's going to be on this team and who's not going to be on this team? Simple as that. This game, kind of like everything you expected going into it. No real news here. The next game is the Kansas City Chiefs versus the LA Chargers. The Chiefs won 17-10. The Chiefs' leading passer is Patrick Mahomes, who had 245 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher is Kareem Hunt, who had 69 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Travis Kelce, who had 89 receiving yards. For the Chargers, their leading passer is Justin Herbert, who had 179 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is J.K. Dobbins, who had 32 rushing yards. And the leading receiver is Ladd McConkey, who had 67 receiving yards and a touchdown. Overall, this game, both teams really played below average, I'd say. The biggest news of this is the Chiefs lost Rashee Rice. Right now, it's not confirmed, but it's being rumored that it's an ACL injury, a torn ACL, and this is just a problem for the Chiefs. It looks like they did get Travis Kelce a little bit back on track because Rashee Rice is injured, but honestly, I think they can trade for a receiver, trade for Amari Cooper, who I'll get to in a second, and overall, this is kind of an uneventful game for both teams. Just neither team played that well. It could have gone either way, and that's kind of all about that. The next game is the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Cleveland Browns. The Raiders won 20-16. Raiders' leading passer is Gardner Minshew, who had 130 yards. Their leading rusher was Alexander Mattison, who had 60 rushing yards. The leading receiver was Jacoby Myers, who had 49 receiving yards. The Browns, their leading passer is Deshaun Watson, who had 176 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Jerome Ford, who had 58 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Jerry Jeudy. So, with the Browns, Amari Cooper's a problem. He's been dropping way too many balls. He looks like he's just given up on routes. He's just been playing bad. Deshaun Watson is at least playing better. He seems on the up and up and playing actually like better than normal in the sense that he's really been sucking this entire time with the Browns and he's just on the upswing. but Amari Cooper is just a problem. And then with the Raiders, they got the win, but Gardner Minshew didn't really look particularly well. Nobody looked particularly well. They were missing Devontae Adams, and it is interesting that their head coach Antonio Pierce liked a post saying that this was Devontae Adams' last game as a Raider. Devontae Adams was not playing due to injury, so he's not holding out or anything, and I think it probably was just an accident in the sense that I don't think Antonio Pierce would purposely like a tweet like that and cause controversy. But overall, this is a little bit concerning if they are going to be missing Devontae Adams because he is by far their best player on offense. And then if you're the Browns, you're a 1-3. Your offense is not hanging with the defense, and the defense is definitely taking a step back. I think there's a lot of cause for concern for the Browns right now. Next game is the Baltimore Ravens versus the Buffalo Bills. The Ravens won 35-10. The Ravens' leading passer was Lamar Jackson, who had 156 yards and 2 touchdowns. The leading rusher was Derrick Henry, who had 199 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Justice Hill, who had 78 yards and a touchdown. With the Bills, their leading passer was Josh Allen, who had 180 yards. Their leading rusher was James Cook, who had 39 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Khalil Shakir, who had 62 receiving yards. Now we finally get to see what the Bills' rushing defense looks like, and it looks terrible. Because what happened is the Bills' offense has been really so amazing that they keep getting up really big early in games, and that forces the defense, or forces the other team's offense to get into passing situations. And so we never really seen them, what their rushing defense looks like. And it's a problem. It's not very good. And the Bills just basically got their butt whooped because they couldn't stop the run. And it's simple as that. And overall, I don't think there's any cause for the Bills. And then the Ravens, I do think they're, even though they're 2-2, I think they're probably one of the best 2-2 teams there is. Like, they should not have, they really could have won all these games that they lost. And overall, I think both teams are going to be the top teams, and this isn't really any concern for the Bills or either team. Well, there's concern for the Bills because they can't stop the run, but I think overall both teams are going to be pretty good and not have to concern about themselves with this one. The next game is the Tennessee Titans versus the Miami Dolphins. The Titans won 31-12. Titans leading passer was Mason Rudolph, who had 85 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Tony Pollard, who had 88 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was DeAndre Hopkins, who had 31 receiving yards. With the Dolphins, their leading passer was Tyler Huntley, who had 96 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Tyler Huntley, who had 40 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Jalen Waddle, who had 36 receiving yards. Overall, Will Levis got injured early on, and he wasn't really playing too great when he did get injured. And then the Dolphins just have a problem at quarterback. Every single time Tua misses a game, the Dolphins just suck. Honestly, I think they should try to trade for Joe Flacco. I think Joe Flacco can be like the pocket passer they need, or they can just give up on the season. Those are kind of the two options. Tyler Huntley isn't the answer. Skylar Thompson isn't the answer. Tim Boyle's not the answer. And then with the Titans, I get Mason Rudolph played a bit better than Will Levis because that's what they're going for, is have a good defense, have a good run game, and then have their quarterback just not blow it. And Will Levis has shown himself incapable of not blowing it. But I just wouldn't want to give up on Will Levis this soon. Mason Rudolph isn't going to be your future franchise quarterback. And with Will Levis, at least you have a shot. I understand that Brian Callahan, their head coach, he didn't draft Will Levis, and so they could kind of get rid of him and be like, hey, that was the other guy's mistake who got him. But still, I think it's way too early to give up on Will Levis. The final game of the week was the Detroit Lions versus the Seattle Seahawks. The Lions won 42-29. The Lions' leading passer was Jared Goff, who had 292 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Jahmyr Gibbs, who had 78 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And the leading receiver was Jameson Williams, who had 80 receiving yards and a touchdown. With the Seahawks, their leading passer was Geno Smith, who had 395 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. The leading rusher was Kenneth Walker, who had 80 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is DK Metcalf, who had 104 receiving yards. I get it, the Seahawks defensive line was injured, but the Lions look back to form. This is the first time in a while they beat the Seahawks, so they kind of broke the yearly tradition of losing to the Seahawks. Jared Goff was perfect with going 18 for 18, as well as catching a touchdown. And the Lions offense really just got back on track. This is what they needed. Jared Goff has been struggling a lot. Their entire passing offense has been struggling a lot, and this is them getting back on track. Their defense didn't do as good of a job as they needed to. They didn't look great. Their defense really let them down quite a bit, but they did play well enough to get the win, and their offense is insanely back on track, and that's really what the Lions need. So that's what happened in week 4 of the NFL season. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. I'll see you on the next one.